afternoon, and I'd like to call the September 24th, 2013 City Council meeting to order. Will you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Go back to please rise.
Thank you. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Francisco?
Here.
Hotchkiss?
Here.
House?
Here.
Murillo?
Here.
Rouse? White? Mayor Snyder?
Here. Are there any changes to the agenda?
No, there aren't, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Public comment. I have a speaker slip right here from David Daniel Diaz, and 2 minutes here at the podium. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Santa Barbara. A couple of weekends ago, I was parked in front of 710 Santa Barbara Street, La Cuesta High School here in Santa Barbara, and I was unloading a disabled person so he could play his music at the farmer's market just down the street. Got a ticket for being there longer than 3 minutes, and I drove by 4 times during the course of the morning. All morning long, nobody else got tickets for parking in the white zone, and I was quite fascinated to see why just one person would get a ticket, but the meter maid would not come around. I talked with the police department to find out the stats, and the woman in charge of parking for the city of Santa Barbara said, we have to go to another department for that. I'm going, well, I thought you had everything in the touch of your fingers with all this technology we provided for you as taxpayers. And she said she didn't want to talk to me anymore because she felt like she couldn't communicate with me. Wow, that is intense stuff. And so it disturbed me, but I was just interested in knowing how many people the city knows that people park in that white zone in front of La Cuesta, just up the street from the farmer's market every Saturday. And why is it that I was the only one that got a ticket that day using a friend's car to transport a disabled person because I was doing an unloading? Kind of queer, if you ask me. And so this right here, I'm going to give to this gentleman over here so he can pass it on to Cam Sanchez. The ticket number and everything's there. Hopefully something can be rectified because it's not cool to do this. But anyhow, something's going on that shouldn't be going on. Why is it?
I think Mr. Hotchkiss has a question for you, unless you want to finish your statement.
Okay. Yeah. The people in the parking said that he had other business to do and he didn't have time to come back. But the city knows that the parking's there and that people in the farmers market always park in the passenger unloading and they never get tickets. So what's going on here? Yes.
Okay. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Yeah, I can't answer that question, but did you follow the procedure? If you explain your story, I think you'll get a sympathetic reading. You have to write it out.
I don't write or type because of my disabilities. I don't write or type because of my disabilities.
Well, get somebody to write or type for you.
Well, that's what happened here. I try to scribble, and so I'm passing this on to you so you can give it over to the police department and have them review it. But I thought it was kind of unusual because all these years, that one area has people never gotten tickets for parking in the passenger loading only because the school's closed on Saturday.
Okay. Well, if you could give that to Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you very much.
We'll go from there. Thank you.
Madam Mayor,
Mr. Wiley.
can I just be clear for the record, there is a process for appealing parking tickets. It has an independent person in the police department that reviews parking tickets. Beyond that, they need to be taken to Superior Court, and there really is no process for someone to file something with the city council or the city administrator.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you. We'll follow up as necessary, and that's the procedure there. Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Are there any other public comment? Speaker slips? No. So that will close public comment. Move on to the consent calendar. You have some items to read.
Item number 2, adoption of ordinance for lease agreement with Jacob Stern and Sons Incorporated, recommending that council adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the council of the city of Santa Barbara approving and authorizing the airport director to execute a 20-year lease agreement between the city of Santa Barbara and Jacob Stern and Sons Incorporated, a Pennsylvania corporation, for a monthly rental of $811 adjusted to the market rate every 5 years for 15,015 square feet of land at 101 Cerro Hartley Place at the Santa Barbara Airport to take effect on the effective date of ordinance. Item number 6, pledge wastewater fund net revenue to payment of Clean Water State Revolving Fund Financing Agreement, recommending that council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara pledging the wastewater fund net revenue to payment of a Clean Water State Revolving Fund Financing Agreement.
Thank you. Without further objection, we'll waive further reading. Any motion to approve the consent calendar, or is there an item that people need to take out?
Move approval of the consent calendar.
Okay.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Up to item number 13.
Status report on Resource Recovery Project.
Thank you. Mr. Four, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. We're here to give another update on the status of the Resource Recovery Project that we've brought to you several times over the past couple of years. We've had some new developments we wanted to bring you up to speed on. The things we want to cover today, a little bit of background on the project, the status of the Marburg proposal. We're going to talk about two different tracks that we're on now. One with working through a proposal that was submitted by Marburg to own and operate the material recovery facility. The second is to talk about a new development, which is the selection of Marburg by Mustang as the material recovery facility for Mustang. Also talk about the potential creation of a joint powers authority, and then the status of where we are with the environmental review process. Just very quickly to remind everybody what is the Resource Recovery Project. As envisioned, it covers three different elements. The first is a material recovery facility that would process the incoming trash. So the focus of the project is to sort and recover the recyclables and the organic material that's currently left in the trash can. The material recovery facility would separate that into three different streams. One would be recyclable material, paper, cardboard, metals, plastics that we would then send to market. The second stream would be the organic material, food, green waste, materials that are contaminated with organic material that would go into the anaerobic digester. And then the residual, which is everything else that it really is truly trash at the end of this process that would ultimately be landfilled. So coming out of the material recovery facility into the anaerobic digester would be that organic material. It would be digested from that process. Methane and biogas would be recovered, and that would be used to generate power and sold back to the grid. And as I said, the remaining material that really truly is valueless at that point would go into the landfill. I wanted to review, we had done this before, but just to talk about where we are in the overall process. And there are about 10 major milestones that go from procurement to accepting waste. We've gotten through about 4 of them. So just to remind everybody where we are, we have completed the technical and financial due diligence on the Mustang project. This was the project that emerged from the RFP process as the preferred project, with the preferred vendor being Mustang. In January, then, we executed a term sheet with Mustang as the preferred vendor. We've initiated the environmental review process with the issuance of the notice of preparation back in April of 2012. We have initiated the due diligence process on the Marburg proposal to construct, own, and operate the MRF on their properties. And then there are about 6 remaining steps that we need to complete. So we will need to complete the environmental review process that we began. We'll need to construct or develop the framework and the key terms of a joint powers agreement or authority that will really define the roles, responsibilities of how the public participants will relate to one another and how we will jointly manage the vendor and the project. I highlighted that because that's one of the primary things that we are talking about today. Following that, we will be negotiating final business terms with the vendor or vendors, executing a contract, constructing the facility, and then beginning to actually process waste. So the first scenario we want to talk about is the status of the Marburg proposal. And we had brought this up back in January, but I want to talk a little bit about the Marburg property and then the Marburg proposal. Back in April of 2012, when the county issued the notice of preparation for the environmental impact report, Marburg submitted a letter requesting that their physical properties in downtown Santa Barbara be considered as the location for the material recovery facility, only one component of the project. And the public participants said, yes, we will do that. In fact, we will study those properties to a level where the decision-making bodies could then select them as the preferred location. So we are going to undertake a very detailed analysis of those properties in the EIR. The AD facility, the anaerobic digester, is still contemplated to be located at Tehiguis. So under this scenario, the MRF would be studied on the downtown properties at Marburg, AD facility at Tehiguis. The next step in that, beyond the geography, is that the multi-jurisdictional solid waste task group then invited Marburg to submit a formal proposal consistent with the RFP. And that proposal then covered the technical, operational, financial components of what it would take to design, build, and operate that facility. By doing so, then, that enables the public participants to undertake the same level of due diligence and analysis of those components that we did on the Mustang proposal. Following the invitation, Marburg submitted its proposal on May 1st, and then consistent with the initial RFP process, Marburg's proposal was then sent to Alternative Resources, Inc. It was the consultant that we used to initially to do the initial review on the other proposals that were received back in October of 2009. And we asked ARI to do two things. First, to determine Marburg's compliance with the minimum evaluation criteria that's listed in the RFP. So in other words, are they a responsive proposer? And then secondly, to compare the technological, operational, and financial assumptions that Marburg used, and then compare those to the assumptions that were used by Mustang in its proposal. And what that will do, it really allows us to make an apples-to-apples comparison between the two proposals. So ARI began that work. They've conducted their initial review. They requested additional information from Marburg that came in to us on September 13th, and we anticipate that ARI will conclude its review and give us a final report on those analyses sometime this fall. So before I go on, are there any questions at this point about the status of the Marburg proposal?
Mr. Francisco.
So would there be one MRF for the county, or would there be a second MRF at Tehiguis?
This would be for one MRF, countywide, or at least in our waste shed.
So waste from all over the county would be transported to the Marburg MRF as the first step?
From the south coast areas of the unincorporated county, Goleta, Buellton, Solvang, and the city, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Ms. Murillo?
Mr. Four, what were the elements that made it apples and oranges that ARI now needs to make them oranges and oranges?
Sure. Cost of construction, cost to operate, personnel deployment, cost of equipment, revenue expectations from recyclable material and things like that.
So it was the way that the financials were broken down? They have to all be presented the same way for comparison? Is that it?
Financials is a big piece of it. It also be the technical specifications, what it will achieve, in terms of diversion, technical, operational, and a big part of it being financial as well.
Thank you.
And just to follow up from mostly Mr. Francisco, part of the analysis of where the MRF is also has to do with traffic back and forth between Tehiguis. So, I mean, if the MRF was at Tehiguis, all the residuals in the commodities piece would all go through Santa Barbara to Ventura, right? Is that still? So that, I think, is a part of the analysis, too. So it's not It's, so the trucks that were coming from Buellton, Solvang, or whatever, part of it, if they went to Tehiguas for some of it, but then some trucks are going to have to go down, pass through Santa Barbara anyway to Ventura to deal with the recyclables at that piece.
Right.
Right.
Our recyclable material ends up at Southern California ports in the end, so everything ends up going that way. Certainly, the traffic impacts will be studied at depth in the EIR.
Great, thank you. And Mr. House?
So as it stands right now, there's the proposal by Mustang, who has selected Marburg to be able to run the one piece of the project, and it could possibly run the other part. And then there's this independent proposal by Marburg. And I understand that needs to kind of be worked out before we get beyond the environmental impact report stage. I mean, somewhere in there it's got to get worked out because it's going to be pretty darn confusing. So what's that process look like?
Well, that's the primary reason why they're having the benefit of their proposal up front prior to release of the draft EIR. It'll really so at the same time that we're studying the geographic location under the environmental impact report, we also have the technical, operational, and financial piece to see the viability of that as an alternative.
So, but if they weren't included as, I mean, it's good to have their proposal because it shows both, and then you can study both, right?
Right.
And then, so let's say they weren't to be ultimately the AD provider. Is that right? The
MRF provider.
The MRF provider.
Mm-hmm.
Then what? What does that do to the environmental impact report? Because it weighs on where it's going to be located. So.
Right. So the way it is now is that on county-owned lands, so for example, Tehiguas landfill with Mustang being the preferred vendor, if everything is cited there, we have our preferred vendor. If the environmental impact report points to a downtown MRF site, then we will have studied it to the point where the decision-making bodies could select it. And then it comes to whether Marburg's proposal is acceptable, as the owner.
Understood. But
Operator.
the site-specific impacts would have been studied.
Right.
I understand.
Exactly.
And so you're going to, the time frame for that, pulling all that together is going to be, I guess that the actual decisions don't happen until after environmental impact reports. I see.
That's why we're doing it now in parallel.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to be so dense, but
No,
thank
not
you.
at all.
It's complicated. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Just, I think I'm reiterating what people said before, but part of this is going to be traffic, pure and simple, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So that's the status of the standalone Marburg proposal to design, own, and operate the MRF on their properties. And switching gears then, I would like to talk about the development on the Mustang side, which is the selection of Marburg by Mustang to be its operator of the MRF. Back in January, we told you that Mustang did not name an operator in its original RFP submittal, but in July of 2013, Mustang named Marburg as its MRF operator and really contemplated to those county-owned sites to which the term sheet applies. And so under this scenario, the vendor would be Mustang, still be Mustang. Both the MRF and the anaerobic digester would be sited on county-owned lands. Marburg would be the MRF operator, and the anaerobic digester, the operator of that, is still yet to be determined and announced by Mustang. So in August of 2013, after we we had a month to do some due diligence and consider it, the participating jurisdictions came back to Mustang and deemed Marburg as an acceptable choice to operate the MRF. And then just, I think we've already hit on this, but just to be clear that this development, the development of Marburg being named as Mustang's operator, does not affect Marburg's standalone proposal to design, own, and operate the MRF on its properties. These are two separate tracks.
If I could ask, when you say county-owned, we're talking out at the landfill?
Landfill or the county-owned transfer station, for example, could be another alternative site.
Is that out there also, though?
By the sheriff's office.
What's that?
Out near the sheriff's office.
Okay, thank you.
So this is a little bit, to try to summarize where we are. This is just a table I put together showing the location of the projects, the vendors, and then the operators. So in the first scenario, under those county-owned sites, for example, Tehiquis, the vendor, if the vendor is Mustang, Mustang has chosen Marburg as the MRF operator, and the AD operator is yet to be determined and announced by Mustang. For the Marburg properties, the vendor of the MRF would be Marburg. They would be the designer and owner. They would also be the operator, but the vendor of the anaerobic digestion facility at Tehiquis would be Mustang. The MRF operator would be Marburg, and then the anaerobic digester operator is yet to be determined by Mustang.
Go ahead.
Did I not read in the report here that Marburg might be the anaerobic digester vendor as well?
Mustang has said, when we asked them about that, they said, yeah, they may be, but they haven't formally announced that to the participating jurisdictions.
Okay.
Nothing excludes them of that. We just haven't been explicitly told that.
Thank you.
So we've covered the status of the Marburg proposal. We've covered this new development as Marburg being selected by Mustang. Now I want to switch gears one more time to talk about how the participating jurisdictions will interact with one another and manage this project. And for a long time, ever since the real genesis of the project, we've talked about at a staff level and an elected official level, what will be the framework that we will all operate under to oversee the project. In 2008, when we initially brought this issue to the Multi-Jurisdictional Solid Waste Task Group, they expressed a preference for a joint powers agreement, a multi-jurisdictional agreement over the creation of a new joint powers authority. Earlier this year, a couple months ago, Multi-Jurisdictional Solid Waste Task Group then supported the creation of an authority. Goleta and county elected officials and the management at the staff level, they've expressed specific interest in an authority, but the cities of Solvang and Buellton have not yet committed. They are taking more of a kind of a wait-and-see approach to how we will organize. City of Santa Barbara staff, we believe that a joint powers authority is less desirable, creates a new governmental entity. There is additional cost to operating that new agency, and that the objectives that we're trying to achieve of managing this contract and this vendor could be met through a joint powers agreement.
Could you just, for all of us, make a distinction? What distinguishes a joint powers authority and a joint powers agreement? What are the differences between the two, just so we are all clear?
The joint power authority would be the new governmental entity with a representative board or board members represented by the participating jurisdictions, a voting rights structure, would have audited financial statements, would have Brown Act requirements for noticing meetings and things like that. The joint powers agreement would be the written document that is signed by all the parties, executed jointly, and then if that agreement were to be amended, it would go back to the separate elected official bodies to then approve any amendments and changes to that agreement.
Got it, everyone? Go ahead, Mr. Rouse. It's complicated, so I wanted to make sure we all know what we're talking about. Mr. Rouse.
It is complicated, and I was going to actually direct a question to Mr. Wiley to help us through the desirability factor in the two scenarios.
Well, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, I've been pretty clear through this process that I see no legal reason, no legal need to create a new legal entity, a new public entity, which is what the authority is proposing. And the only reason to date that the county staff has come up with doing that the only real reason is that they would prefer to have the authority so they would only have to submit amendments to the operating agreement with the resource recovery operator. The amendments to that agreement would only have to be approved by that JPA board. And that's not really a legal reason. That's just a apparent desire for them to only have to ask one new board to amend the agreement. So Hope that answers your question.
So essentially what you're saying is on the other scenario, then it would have to go back to all the jurisdictions each time we'd have to go through an approval as opposed to going to that one board then.
And there are different ways to do this. There's ways to say that minor amendments don't have to be approved by all members of an agreement. Let's say there's 5 members, you could say that any amendment costing less than $25,000 would only have to be approved by 3 out of the 5. And there's ways to be very specific about the sort of amendments that would require all 5 of the entities to an agreement, all 5 of the signatories to agreement to when it has to be unanimous, so.
Well, I guess the devil's in the details, but I was wondering about scenarios where there could be certain areas that are then their interests are not represented because they are in the minority of a vote, or if some areas would fall into a protest mode or whatever. I mean, I'm sure that all that would be worked out in whatever the structure would be, but I can see both sides of the scenario, though.
Well, yes, and, as Mr. Ford mentioned, our preference, and in fact, the council indicated years ago, a preference for a joint powers agreement. Excuse me. That would be an agreement signed by the 5 public entities and by the operator of the resource recovery park. And so when you have an agreement like that, any changes to it would have to have everyone sign off on the changes. That's our preference. We don't feel that that's somehow administratively difficult or to do. And this is balanced with no apparent need for an authority, no legal reason to have an authority, to have to worry about annual audits and the compliance with the Brown Act and things like that. So just to get back to our concern was with an authority that we see this as an agreement that is focused on a very specific project, the resource recovery project, and that's it. It's not, we don't see it as something that was going to govern solid waste on the South Coast or divest the city or any city of Santa Barbara or any other city of any of its jurisdiction over its franchise hall or anything like that. Just an agreement, 20-year agreement having to do with a resource recovery park. And that's where we're coming from, where we don't see a need to amend that agreement without our city council approving that amendment.
Thank you.
So for example, with SB CAG, I'm the city's rep that sits on the board of SB CAG, and I'm one of, 13 votes that, and SB CAG makes its own decisions, right? Not all decisions from SB CAG comes to this body to make a decision. And so sometimes we're in the majority of a vote, and sometimes we're not in the majority of the vote, depending on the vote. And that would be like a joint powers authority would be like that, as opposed to an agreement, which actually LOSAN, which is the rail corridor, newly established joint powers agreement, that's all the rail corridors from San Diego up through San Luis Obispo. Each of the county association of governments in those areas have representatives on that agreement, but when there are changes, when there are amendment requests to that agreement, it has to go to each of those different, like SBCAG and VCTC and SCAG and all of those, and in the way this one's written up, they have to unanimously agree to any agreement before it's made. So that's a distinction on 2 boards I've been on.
So essentially you're saying it's the same functionality without the creation of a new entity then?
Mm-hmm. I think the other issue is, I think since for us in this city is we comprise, I think, 40% of the waste stream. So if there was a joint powers authority, and if everything was just by majority rule or majority vote, which doesn't have to be the case, but if it is, we could find ourselves with an amendment proposal that the city of Santa Barbara may not like, but we may be in the minority of a vote under this joint powers authority agreement, unless the arrangement was such that we had veto power or something like that, which is on the table, I think, in discussions. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So you say there would be, or there may be additional cost. Do you have an idea of what the additional cost may be?
Not at this point. I mean, we know that there would be the cost of an audit. There could be some staffing costs, but at this point, we don't know.
Right, but Mr. Wiley said that the meetings would have to be notified under the Brown Act, and I could see that costing staff time, or when might you know how much more it would cost?
Yeah, I've been involved with other joint powers authorities, and the main cost is keeping a separate set of books and having an annual audit. And it's probably in the $10,000 a year range to create this authority. It may be a little higher, but it's not going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. But there's a cost to it because this is a separate government agency that you've created, and it has a separate set of books, and it's got to then be monitored separately. But it'll be typically done by, probably in this case, by the county staff will do that. Then they will staff the authority.
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. If we found that the agreement system that we're proposing here didn't work, is it changeable down the line?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, the five-way joint powers agreement is perfectly changeable, except that all parties to the agreement
Have to agree.
will have to agree. It's
That's-
like any contract.
Right.
You don't always or only have two-party contracts.
Right.
Essentially, what we're talking about when we say a joint powers agreement is we're talking about a six-party contract, 5 public entities and the operator of the resource recovery park.
Right. Do either one of these affect who is actually running the show, if I can put it that way?
No, and I think that's been part of, we always acknowledge, everyone understands and agrees that the same level of county staff, county public works staff, supervision and involvement, it makes sense that they would be the lead agency, if you will. I don't mean that in a CEQA sense, but assuming a project built on county property, it makes sense for the county public works staff to staff the whether it's an authority to staff the authority or to oversee the administration of an agreement with the resource recovery park operator.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. House?
It sounds like the Mustang or Marburg would actually be tasked with running the whole show. They'd be the administrators of the whole affair. And you're talking about to whom they're accountable, and they're accountable to the jurisdictions under one form or another of structure, I guess I'm trying to understand what this is. It's a policy board, basically, but it's more than that. It's an accountability structure of some sort for performance. Would it be true that to whom the operator would be reporting on their performance would be the Joint Powers Authority, or would it, how would that work if it was an agreement? They would be just all independent, only available to participate if there were a major question like an amendment to the agreement. But to whom are they answerable for their performance?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, the lawyers would draft for that. But you raise a good point when you mention accountability, because maybe that's a better way to look at it. If a joint powers authority were to be created, a new legal entity, and then the county staff administered this project, they would only be accountable to the board of the authority. And that's the problem we have with that concept, is that we want accountability to flow back to the individual city councils or the board of supervisors.
I see.
So if we were to go with the option of a joint powers agreement, a large section of this agreement would deal with accountability. In other words, we would probably say, so far so good. The county's been operating Tehiguis for years. It seems to be working fine. The county will, quote unquote, operate this or supervise the operation of this resource recovery park. Once it's built and operated by, say, Marburg, the county will supervise that. But in terms of accountability, if there's some problem with the operation, then the 5 entities would have a say to say, we, maybe on an annual basis, you look at accountability and you say, we want to come revisit how this is being operated. And that would all have to be in either agreement. You're going to have to deal with that either way, but I think our concern is that with the authority, the accountability stops at the board of that authority, and presumably Santa Barbara would only have one vote on the board of that authority.
Okay, thanks.
So, sort of taking into account what we already, what we've talked about or what you've talked about, the staff does recognize the value of a cooperative arrangement. Staff could support the creation of an authority or joining authority membership if the city did retain control over amendments to the resource recovery project. And that's really what we've talked about today, is retaining our autonomy and not having that contract change or be amended without city approval. In a letter to county staff, we proposed a voting arrangement where amendments to the resource recovery project would have to be unanimously approved by the 3 largest generators participating in this project, namely the county, Goleta, and the city of Santa Barbara. And that would preserve city autonomy in decisions related to amendments to the contract with the resource recovery project vendor. And then all other decisions related to the JPA would then be made based on a majority vote of the overall JPA board. So that is another alternative. That's actually what we're recommending, staff is recommending today, is that we go through the process of looking at the creation of a joint powers authority and see if we can come up with a structure similar to what's on the screen here.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Four, is there any reason that it couldn't be structured, say, the voting share is pro rata based on the percentage of the waste stream?
It could be. That's something that was initially developed, and in all of those models, we looked at things like having a certain number of parties voting in favor, plus, you had to have a certain number of agencies voting your way, plus a percentage of the waste stream. That's possible, but only this arrangement that we put up here completely preserves city autonomy, and that, in relation to this specific contract, that was our goal.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions on that? Okay, go ahead.
So the last topic I'd like to talk about today is just the status of the environmental review, which is sort of the overarching umbrella over all these topics. As I said earlier, the county issued the notice of preparation for the environmental impact report back in April of 2012. County staff and city planning staff have been diligently gathering all of the additional information on the Marburg property, since now the city has a very large role in this, to do all of the technical studies and do all of the analysis in the EIR, so that when the environmental impact report is final, you will have the ability to then select a downtown property if you deem it the preferable choice. We are anticipating that the draft EIR will be released sometime between January and March of 2014. And while it's not designed to do so, what the environmental impact report is really going to do for us is point which vendor or vendors we will end up negotiating with. If the environmental impact report points to county-owned properties, we know we'll be negotiating with Mustang. If it points to a downtown Santa Barbara site, then we know we would be negotiating with Marburg for that Marburg property, or we'll be negotiating with both. If it's a Marburg MRF site and then the anaerobic digester at Tehiguis. So it's not the point of CEQA, but it will end up being one of those natural outcomes. It gets a little bit complicated if the environmental impact report points to a downtown Marburg site and yet their proposal and the rates are not acceptable. Then the viability of that site as an alternative under the EIR is called into question. So we'll see how that shakes out. But that's really where we are with the environmental review process. And you'll see that draft EIR. We'll make sure you see that when it's released in the first quarter of the next calendar year. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you, and I want to acknowledge there's representatives from Mustang and Marburg and the county all here. Thank you for being here. Do you want to say anything at this point, or just open for questions? When things are going good, just sit down and stay there. Okay, got it. Any questions or comments?
I have one more.
Go ahead, Ms.
Madam
Maria.
Mayor. So in the CAR, Mr. Four, you mentioned another complication with the EIR process. If the EIR concluded that the city-located Marburg property is deemed the environmentally preferable location for the MRF, without Marburg's proposal, the environmentally preferable option would suddenly be infeasible. Can you just expound on that a little bit more? That isn't exactly what you said a minute ago, right?
Not, and that's a development that has occurred after the publication, after the report was in for publication, is that when we were first, I would say a couple weeks ago when we were drafting this report, we knew that Mustang had chosen Marburg as the operator of its MRF. And then on this hand there was the standalone Marburg proposal. And we thought, well, what happens if Marburg is selected to be the operator, Mustang's operator on either site, on its own properties or on the county-owned properties? That's what the report references. Since then, we've received, when we were clarifying with Marburg what their intentions were, we received a letter from Marburg saying, for the county-owned sites, we are indeed Mustang's operator of the MRF. But as it pertains to the Marburg downtown properties, that partnership ends. There will be no partnership between Marburg and Mustang on the Marburg properties. So you can see how fast this is changing, and in just a couple of days, this staff report became outdated.
Go ahead.
Okay, I need to see those letters that are going back and forth. If something comes in late, I don't like feeling like there's things I don't know, if that sounds obvious. But I'm going to stay in touch with you, Mr. Four.
Okay, I'll
Thank
be
you.
sure and keep you informed.
So Mr. White and I represent the city on the multi-jurisdictional solid waste task group. I don't know if there's any other direction from the council on what's been here today, or there's no motion for today, it's just an update. Anything else from the council that you'd want us to know now? Now's a good time to tell us, or maybe it's already been said. When is the next multi-jurisdictional solid waste task group meeting? Is there one scheduled, or are we waiting for the draft EIR to come out?
There isn't one scheduled yet. There may be one when the findings of the ARI report on the Marburg proposal come out. That may be a topic that we take up. And certainly when the draft EIR is to be released in the first quarter of the calendar year, those would be two topics that I think we would certainly bring to the multi-jurisdictional group.
And when do we expect to hear from Muleton and Solvang on their views, whether it's an agreement or an authority? Have they already? They haven't.
They haven't signaled that. What they've told us is, we understand it. We're going to take a little, tell us what you come up with, and we'll make a decision at that point.
Okay. Okay.
One last thing?
Yes,
May
go
I?
ahead.
So I'm sorry, did you say, you said ARI will finish its comparison analysis in fall?
Right.
So so any minute now or next month?
Well, there were some big information requests that ARI made of Marburg. We just received those on September 13th, and now ARI is finishing their analysis based on the information that came in. So, we want to make sure we afford them the time to get the report right, and we think that would occur in the next month or two.
And then that report will go to Councilmember White and Mayor Schneider, because they're the two, or they're on that multi-jurisdictional group. What's going to happen when you receive ARI's report? Can I have a copy?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll see. Yeah, let me get back to you on that. I mean, I think we want to see the report, and then we will likely bring it to at a minimum to the multi-jurisdictional task group, and it would be a public record, I would think. Yeah.
What did he say?
We will bring major developments on that report back to council.
And I think the only thing, if there's some kind of proprietary financial information that's submitted by or the parties, that's the part that I think there would be concern whether or not it's a public record. Otherwise, I believe it would be a public record.
Thank you.
And certainly those meetings are open to the public too, so it's not like you can't come. If you want to, you're welcome to. Okay, I believe that's it for this item. Thank you all for being here. To be continued. we have any council member committee assignment reports? Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yesterday, I went to the United Way, what's it called here? Fun in the Sun Power Reading Program, United for Literacy, and got to read to some of my peer group, i.e. the first through second graders, which was kind of fun. And what was interesting about it was the results, talking to Paul Didier about the results of what's gone on with this program. 97% of these participants showed average gains of over 2 reading grade levels in a very, very short time, and gained over 36 words per minute. So these are kids that are actually reading books and not playing with electronic games, and it's kind of refreshing and kind of fun to see.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The Planning Commission last Thursday met to discuss the ZIRs and are really digging into it, I think, in a thoughtful, in-depth way. There's more for them to do, and so they continued the matter, and there's more discussion to be had. It seemed like at least one piece of that conversation was that the ZIR appeared to be well thought of as a tool in general concept at Planning Commission, and then an area where there just seemed to be a whole range of concerns is the consequences of the reports that are inaccurate and the consequences of finding things that are not legal, and then how that's processed. All of that, it seems like the PC is taking that on to be able to give some good advice on.
Mr. House?
Last Friday, the Beacon Board met, and one of the topics of discussion had a lot to do with the need for dredges to be available, a dredge to be available on the West Coast here, this part of the long stretch of California. Our harbor has our own particular agreement, which sort of sets us apart. But if you go to Channel Islands Harbor, Ventura, Port Hueneme, there are significant problems there with getting the sand to get where it belongs and keep it out of their channels and keep it on their beaches. And some of the issues that happen up here that's facing us at Goleta Beach, for instance, are multiplied by factors of 10 down in Port Hueneme area. So there's a big push for having an authority for the West Coast to be able to do a coordinated effort and keep that kind of dredging available. And there's a lot of detail, and this is one of these things, kind of like what we just talked about, it gets pretty complicated. But that board and the staff is working really diligently to try to get the federal support and the funding to be able to do what's right here on the coast.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Just a quick question for Mr. House. That wouldn't affect our dredging now, which is pretty successful with the Army Corps of Engineers every year, correct?
Yeah, we have a pretty unique arrangement because of the Coast Guard's presence, and so our harbor seems. I've talked to Scott Reedman. He feels pretty good that we've got a solid arrangement.
Right.
But that's not true in Ventura
Right.
Harbor. It's not true down near the port of Port Hueneme and the stretch of beach, which was kind of artificially manufactured to create a successful opening for that harbor. And as a result, their beach has gone away completely, and they're having to harden it, which is something that all of us hate to see, because that can cause even more problems. But that has to do with a shortfall in funding, having to do with sequester, actually. And so a historical problem of shortfalls of funding, but finally getting down to where there just isn't enough money to bring the dredge out here or to spend enough time to do the work that needs to be done. So there's a wish for some more self-determination on the part of all the jurisdictions along the coast, from Oregon all the way down.
Again, but my question is, or my point is, we don't want to threaten what we're doing now successfully.
Yes.
Which is vital to our harbor.
It wouldn't affect that.
Good, thank you.
And that's an important point that I also raised for the board. It was important that if we do encourage and support something that would have larger regional implications of coordinating all the efforts for all the harbors along the way and the beaches, that we didn't do anything to damage our unique arrangement here in Santa Barbara.
Councilmember Maria, myself, and Mr. Armstrong were at the League of California Cities annual conference last week in Sacramento, and a lot of good updates about funding and laws and redevelopment agency. I think Mr. Armstrong said that, told me that Chris McKenzie, the executive director, says Santa Barbara's the envy of the state because we kept our parking lots, and actually city after city throughout the state is getting a no vote from the Department of Finance. So stay tuned on a statewide basis what's going to happen. Pasadena, Santa Monica, I mean, you can name a whole bunch of cities who are going through that. So I really want to say kudos to our staff and all the work that we did and got voted back to the city right away. So that it was not good news to hear for others, but it really showed, I think, the good work of our own staff. So with that, I'd like to, we have some closed sessions to read.
Item number 14, conference with real property negotiators. Item number 15, conference with labor negotiator. And item number 16, conference with real property negotiators.
Thank you, and we'll adjourn from closed session. Thank you very much.